Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 4113, Class 20 on Phillis Wheatley. She's born around the year 1753 in West Africa. She's enslaved. She is purchased by the Wheatley family of Boston, who gave her her surname and her first name. And she learns English and then learns to read and write by studying alongside their children. And she learns to write in English and then eventually also learns Latin. And she writes English poetry and she becomes a kind of celebrity. She is taken to London with a husband of the Wheatley family, and she meets important people in England. She meets important people in the Americas, and she is liberated by the Wheatley family shortly before they die. Unfortunately, she doesn't have much money. She marries a black grocer who is himself in debt, and she has to do something that she hadn't done in a long time, which is to do physical labor. Not being in very good health, she dies, unfortunately, at a very young age in her early 30s. So her book is the first book of poetry published with poetry by a Black woman in English in the Americas. So what can we learn from her, this image here? Well, we can see that we have the title of the work, we have her name, and then we have this relationship of servility that's stressed. Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England, a phrase that's repeated right here. Then we have all the copyright information, the year it's published and so forth, which asserts her intellectual property over this book. But I'm just particularly struck by this image where we have her looking into the distance like a poet. She's thinking poetic thoughts and maybe composing verse in her head. That's what's being represented. She's at a table that is given entirely over to poetic labor. She has a book which shows that she's literate, and she has an inkwell, and she's writing on paper that is entirely blank. So it's not as if she's borrowing this paper from other purposes. She's seated in a chair that looks, quite dignified, and she's wearing, she's dressed like a respectable person. But this particular pose of holding her chin in her hand and looking is something we're going to see for representing poets in general in this period. So there's famously this portrait of John Keats by Joseph Severn. Keats is one of the canonical poets of the early 19th century in England, and here we have him similarly posed, where he has his head in his hand, staring off in the distance, probably represented as composing poetry lines in his head, maybe some of his famous sonnets. And there's a line of verse down here, or maybe an open book, where he's thinking about these things. So Wheatley is being presented in exactly the same way, and I think that's interesting as a kind of tension on that cover page. Then we can think about this here, this dedication to the Right Honorable Countess of Huntingdon. The following poems are most respectfully inscribed by her very much obliged, very humble and devoted servant, Phillis Wheatley. So the Countess of Huntingdon is a wealthy aristocrat in London whom Wheatley unfortunately was not able to meet because the Countess was ill that day. But Wheatley did meet a lot of important people in London, as she did in Boston. And the Countess of Huntingdon was very interested in Wheatley and her poetry. So what does it mean for Wheatley to call herself her humble and devoted servant? Well, in a legal and technical sense, she is the servant, indeed enslaved by the Wheatley family. And that's something that she has no choice over. Well, the only choice she has is to self-liberate in some way, maybe by running away to Canada, or maybe by earning enough money to purchase her own freedom, like Olaudah Equiano did. But that relationship of servility is one that really effectively she mostly does not choose. But she has the choice to address herself to the Countess of Huntingdon as her humble servant, right? It's a relationship of patronage that she's seeking out. It's a relationship of servility that she is choosing for herself, and she's using the language of polite society. So here is from a collection of letters sent to the famous 18th century English actor, David Garrick, which I've just drawn on here. Simply went to Google Books and searched for the phrase most humble and obedient servant. which is a phrase you're going to find used throughout this and indeed throughout letters written in this period. It doesn't mean that these people want to be enslaved by David Garrick. They are just seeking out his favor and using the language of polite society as free subjects. So we have a real tension there on that previous page, one between Wheatley as an enslaved person and Wheatley as somebody who's a poet who's seeking out patrons. And that's something maybe we can talk about in detail in class today. Then we have this page here. One of the things about, Wheatley is, Phillis Wheatley, is that white supremacists by the late 18th century were convinced that Black people could not reason as well as white people. This is a way that white people were able to convince themselves that they were superior. And so they would claim that Black people, as we saw Thomas Jefferson did, that they were irrational, that they were emotional, that they could not have higher thoughts, and so on. And so for Phillis Wheatley to write poetry and to do it quite well was really a challenge to the basic beliefs of white supremacists. And so we have this book then has to attest that Wheatley is the actual author of these poems. Wheatley himself, John Wheatley, the man who purchased her, gives a short biography of her, saying this is where she was born. She came here when she was 7 or 8 years old when I purchased her, basically. And then she learned English quickly, of course. She's under the age of 10, so you can do that. And then she becomes a really accomplished poet, which is a really unusual thing. And then she starts to learn Latin. And then we also have the most important people in Boston examining her. So we have the governor, Thomas Hutchinson. We have people like John Hancock, who signed the Declaration of Independence, examining her. And they write this: "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following page or pages were, as we verily believe, written by Phillis, a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa, and has ever since been, and now is, under the disadvantage of serving as a slave in a family in this town. She has been examined by some of the best judges and is thought qualified to write them." So we can only imagine what this would have been like to be questioned by these distinguished and powerful white men who are there to assure themselves that this teenager or woman in her early 20s, perhaps at that point, was Black, had written these poems. It must have been enormously uncomfortable. And I'm really struck by this phrase, an uncultivated barbarian. Have that in mind when we finally get to the poem we're going to talk about in this slideshow. So then we have some other evidence of her as somebody that people are interested in. And that is this poem by Jupiter Hammond, born in the early part of the 18th century, died in the early part of the 19th century. Jupiter Hammond was enslaved. He was a Black man, and he lived on Long Island, this place that's now the Joseph Lloyd Manor House. So you can go visit that actually in present day. And he was, apart from being a slave who worked in the house of the Lloyd family, he also was a minister. He was a preacher. And so he heard of Phillis Wheatley. He never met her, read her poetry, and was really struck by it, and wrote a poem to her where he tries to give her spiritual advice because he's a preacher. And I'm really struck by this way of Black writers forming their own communities and discourse communities that's completely independent of white people, right? Hammond is not doubting at all that Wheatley is the writer of these poems because he himself is a poet. He knows, of course, that Black people can write poems in English. And he writes this poem that's basically over the course of about 20 stanzas, each one of which is basically telling her how to be a good Christian, combined with citations from scripture, from the Bible, which is a book he knows extremely well, as Phillis Wheatley herself probably knows it extremely well. So this is not a poem that's talking about, really, it's not talking about the Black experience, it's talking about the Christian experience, right? But the fact that it's a Black writer writing to another Black writer was, I think, enormously significant and says something about, we can wonder how it is that Jupiter Hammond managed to hear Phillis Wheatley or get his hands on that book of poetry. How did it make its way from Boston to Long Island? So now we can look at this poem here. On being brought from Africa to America. This is a very frequently anthologized poem. If you've ever read Phillis Wheatley's poetry, you've probably read this one, if you've never read anything else by her. And the poem goes like this: "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. The early reception of this poem by African American critics in the early 1970s was characterized by one of disappointment. This was not a poem that is easy to read as anti-slavery. It sounds like she's saying it's actually good that I was enslaved because it allowed me to become Christian. And by the way, white Christians, you should understand, says the poem, that Black people are also going to be going to heaven if they become Christians, right? So it seems to be a kind of missionary poem without any criticism of slavery and certainly no anger expressed towards white people. These critics would prefer something like the writings of David Walker, an early 19th century writer in Boston, a black man who called for armed uprising against white people for their total destruction for the crime of slavery. And he had this book distributed throughout the South to his great peril and the peril of his allies. Phillis Wheatley's poem doesn't seem to be anything like that. It seems to be weirdly pro the slave trade. She was 16 years old when she wrote it. She was still enslaved. That may be important. Do we have to apologize for it? Well, we can also interpret it. And that leads us to something like this. Let's see if I can get, there you go. Here's a slide. We need to go back a little bit. And here we go. Computer is being very bad today. So Susan Lippert Martin, in the academic journal The Explicator, which does short essays that interpret poetry, writes an essay called Diabolic Dye, Commodities and Refinement in Phillis Wheatley's On Being Brought from Africa to America. And she reads this one line very closely. Their color is a diabolic dye. A dye is, of course, something you use to change the color of something else. It's not dyeing as in like losing your life, but rather dyeing as in changing your color. What's that a reference to? Well, the most common dye, perhaps in this period, is indigo. And this allows Lippert Martin to say, her allusion to diabolic dye is clever, as indigo dye was produced by slave labor and a valuable commodity that was sent across the Atlantic to European consumers. In particular, the promotion of indigo was the catalyst for an act of mercy on the part of Quaker minister and abolitionist John Woolman, who in 1762 instituted the practice of Quaker gray apparel after refusing to wear any clothing colored with dye produced by slave labor. And so a Quaker is a sect of Christianity, and they're kind of radical dissenting figures who are dedicated to, say, pacifism, for example. And so we have here in this one line, this color is a diabolic dye, in quotation marks. This is something that she's imagining that some say, white supremacists, saying about Black people, saying that Black people are Black and that Blackness is a sign they've been touched by the devil, therefore they can never become true Christians. But she, according to Lippert Martin, Phillis Wheatley is actually alluding here to indigo, to the indigo trade, and saying that the diabolic dye is actually this dye is produced by slave labor. And the people who are decked out most precisely in diabolic dye are the people who are wearing dark colored clothing. They're not like Quakers who dress in gray. And so she's turning this phrase back against them, right? It's a very subtle and complicated reading, but it's satisfying, I think, because it kind of gives us a little bit of an edge here in this poem, where it sounds maybe it's a little bit of resistance to white supremacy in it. Then we have something like this. William J. Sheik, Phillis Wheatley's appropriation of Isaiah. And here he is reading this line, remember Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain. And to him, the important things are the italics, Christians, Negro, Cain, and this comma. Again, reading extremely closely, seeing every tiny little detail is something that's important. And so he writes this, these same lines can be read to suggest that Christians should remember that in a spiritual sense, both white and Black people are the sin-darkened descendants of Cain. That is, everybody who's colored by sin, who labors under the burden of sin, is in some spiritual way a descendant of Cain, who murdered his brother Abel in the story from the Bible. Basically, Wheatley here, according to Sheik, is fighting back against the notion that Cain's descendants are Black and that white people are descended from like someone else. So Wheatley's revision of this myth possibly emerges in part as a result of her indicative use of italics, which equates Christians, Negroes, and Cain. And he's getting this from someone named Lavernier in an essay about Wheatley. Notice that he paraphrases it. That's something that I think you should do in your second paper. Get very good at paraphrase. And so as he reads it, it's Christians, Negroes, comma, Black as Cain. That Black as Cain refers both to Christians and Negroes. Not just simply to Negroes, saying that everybody, every human being is darkened with sin. And this idea that only one particular group of people is darkened is nonsense. The darkness, the condition of being in sin is something that's universal, and that Black people and white people both need to seek out Christ. And so this is in some ways also a resistance to white supremacy. Again, it has to be discovered by reading the poem very carefully. Are these interpretations correct? Maybe, maybe not, but they're enormously satisfying. Why is that? Well, let me show you one more thing. There's an essay that I read a few weeks ago by Elaine O. Young, What We Mean by Reading, from the journal New Literary History, 2020, pages 93 to 114. Elaine O. Young is both a literary critic and somebody who works in cognitive science. And so she's interested in the way that we think, in the way that the fundamental structures of the human brain can help us understand how literary interpretation works and how literary pleasure works. And so she has a couple of key observations that when a professional academic literary critic is writing literary criticism, the thing they don't do is they don't just paraphrase, right? They don't ever just repeat the obvious thing. And so if they're going to read Phillis Wheatley's poem about being brought from Africa to America, they're not simply going to repeat the overt, obvious content. What's the point of that? So it's not just enough to understand what's happening. If you're a professional literary critic, you have to look at every tiny little detail. And every professional academic literary critic generally believes that nothing is accidental, that every use of italics, every comma, every line break is something you can look at and try to reconstruct the meaning of what's happening, or to seek out some new pattern. And this notion of seeking out a new pattern is in fact enormously important, because this is what academic literary critics do above all. They find new ways to connect small portions of the text and to present that to us, and who are the readers of academic literary criticism. We read this stuff and we go, ooh, that's a really interesting way to look at that. I would never have noticed that on my own. And that pleasure is something that's absolutely fundamentally important to the way that academic literary criticism works. So it's more satisfying to find surprising patterns, to say, oh, that comma in the Phillis Wheatley poem is really significant. The use of the word die is really significant. The use of those italics, Christians, Negroes, Cain, very significant. And if you look at that stuff very closely, you can generate new patterns and make us see the poem in a new way that we wouldn't have been able to see on our own. And so Elaine O. Young says, according to cognitive perspectives on aesthetic pleasure, attending to literary texts can become interesting and rewarding in itself when we are able to discover in them previously unperceived forms of order. So when you're going to write your second paper, think about that. Think about what kind of patterns can I create here? How can I draw connections between things that I wouldn't otherwise notice? And think that you're basically producing something that's going to be a kind of satisfying puzzle that you create and then you solve and you offer it to me. That's what a lot of academic literary criticism actually is. So we can have that in mind and return finally to this poem, which I will read one last time. On being brought from Africa to America, 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once a redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. What does it mean, for example, if we read this as remember Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain, where Phillis Wheatley is addressing all white people who are white Christians and speaking back to this particular line. Maybe there's something we can do there. Maybe there's a pattern we can find in Wheatley that finds another way that this is resisting the kind of praise of the middle passage that this poem seems to be offering. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.